Yeah.
We can see the top and the bottom of the screen.
Okay,
And from
we're
here
live.
to the end of it,
Yep,
we're good.
we're live. So anytime you want to start.
Okay, we are live. Okay. I'm glad we're live.
That's a positive.
That's a positive. Okay.
Generally speaking, yes.
Friends, I'm going to begin. We have a lot to do today. This is great material, and this pains me so much to have to go over it so quickly. But if we're going to finish the Gospel of Mark before the end of October, which I've scheduled for us to have classes through it, we need to move along. So we did 3 chapters last time. We're going to try and do maybe 6, maybe as many as 7 chapters today. I'm going to call this class Jesus the Predictor. Last week it was Jesus the miracle worker, and we saw Jesus perform a number of miracles. What I want to do is talk today, briefly review some of the things that we did last week, and then move into this new section of material, hoping to get up through 1052. If we don't, we'll at least, I hope, finish chapter 8, and then we'll pick up 9 and 10 next week if we need to do it that way. But today, Jesus the Predictor, we're going to see that there's a slight change in emphasis on the portrait of Jesus. But to review the structure of Mark's Gospel, I indicated last time that the focus, and this is obvious, focus of the Gospel of Mark is on Jesus and the portrait of Jesus. But in Mark's Gospel, there are 2 very distinct portraits of Jesus. The first portrait we're going to see in the first part is the powerful Christ, and the miracles of Jesus are going to be emphasized in the first 8 chapters. But starting in 8:31, and I hope we get to that point today, I'm going to show you that we're going to pivot to the end of the Gospel. And now the events leading up to and including the death of Jesus are going to dominate the action in the second half of Mark. So I like to call the first portrait the powerful Christ, the second one the suffering Christ. And then we have a prologue and an epilogue, which I mentioned last time. So if you look at what we covered, I'll go back through this very quickly. We have the title, Mark 1:1, or is it the title? The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, which is not a full sentence. Is that intended to be the title of the work? Or is it saying that the story begins here with John the Baptist? Because John the Baptist is introduced right after that, followed by the baptism of Jesus and the wilderness temptation of Jesus. All of that is the prologue. Then Jesus is going to begin his public ministry starting in 1:14, and the very first thing he does in that ministry is call his first disciples in chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. And after he calls his first disciples, he's going to begin performing miracles. There are 5 miracles that Jesus performs in the first 3 chapters of Mark's Gospel. See if you remember these miracles. The first is a man with an unclean spirit in chapter 1. The second is the healing of Simon Peter's mother-in-law. I always ask my students, was Simon Peter married? And I say one of the benefits of being married is having a mother-in-law. And here is Simon's mother-in-law. So Peter was married. Then we had the cleansing of a leper. 3 really impressive miracles in the first chapter. Then we see at the beginning of chapter 2 the healing of the paralytic. This is the one who is dropped through the ceiling, and Jesus gets him to stand up and walk. And then in chapter 3, he's going to heal a man with a withered hand, the beginning of that chapter. And when he finishes those 5 miracles, Jesus is going to go home. In 3:19b, we're told that Jesus goes home. And the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. The scribes who came down from Jerusalem said he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of demons he casts out demons. What Jesus has shown himself to be in those first 3 chapters is incredibly powerful in word and deed. Whatever he says happens. So he's able to cast out demons, but he's also able to confound the Pharisees and silence them. But have these miracles and have these statements that Jesus has made in his controversy stories, has that in fact convinced people who he truly is? Well, when he goes home, you would think his family would recognize who he is. But according to this, they go out to restrain him because they think he's not playing the full deck. They think he is out of his mind. And the other group that certainly should know are the scholars of the day. These are the scribes who came down from Jerusalem, and yet they think he is acting out of some kind of alliance with the forces of evil. So do the miracles of Jesus, does his power in fact convince people about who Jesus truly is, his true identity? As we see, it does not. And so when he goes home the first time, no one is convinced. In fact, people are confounded. Rather than clarify his identity, his miracles and his teachings confound. They cloud his identity from those who witness these events or hear him teach. Okay, that's what we did last time. The next chapter is chapter 4. And now we're going to begin sort of another cycle. You'll see that there's several cycles of narrative in the Gospel of Mark, but a second cycle of miracles. If you like those first 5, you're really going to like these next 4, because the next 4 are not sort of your average run-of-the-mill miracles. These, in fact, are super miracles. But before we get to that, we're going to have a little section of parables. The parables of Jesus are concentrated in Mark's Gospel, primarily in chapter 4. And after telling the parable of the sower, which confounds the disciples, we read this passage of why Jesus speaks in parables. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables." Or another way of putting it would be in riddles, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Now, I learned in Sunday school many, many, many years ago that Jesus taught in parables in order to be better understood. Right? Didn't you learn that? Wasn't that he spoke in parables because he wanted people to understand? Well, according to this passage, exactly the opposite is the case. He doesn't want people to understand. The parables are intended to cloud. They may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. This is actually from the call of the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. This is what Jesus says to his disciples, but the important point is, he says, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God." So the disciples and those around him are going to have this secret information. They're going to know what these parables mean, whereas people outside who hear these things are going to be completely confounded. He tells some more parables, and then we find another passage a little bit later in Mark chapter 4, where it says, "Where many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples." So here the disciples have an inside track. They're going to see these incredible miracles that Jesus performs, but they're also going to hear Jesus teaching, and they're going to be, everything is going to be explained to them. So the disciples of all people should certainly understand who Jesus is. Right? We'll see. Okay, we have four more miracles. This is trouble at the sea. It's trouble at sea. I love this. This is such a great, this is a nature miracle. There are two different types of miracles that Jesus performs. They're nature miracles, so the feeding of the 5,000 and the stilling of the storm and things like that are nature miracles over against healings that you have. Withered hand and the lame man and the leper and the like are physical healings. Well, here's trouble at sea. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped, but he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. I just love this story. Here you have a description of miracles in the New Testament tend to have great detail. So you find out all kinds of, this is a really severe situation. This isn't just sort of a windstorm, not sort of waves lapping against the boat. This is all hell breaking loose on the Sea of Galilee. Waves are coming into the boat, and the boat is being swamped, and you contrast that with Jesus asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. The disciples are panicked, they're terrified, they don't know what to do, so they wake Jesus up, they shake him, and we find out. They woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. So just picture this in your mind. Jesus gets awakened out of his nap. People shaking him, "Jesus, don't you care that we're going down, we're going down?" And Jesus sort of gets up with, "Oh, peace, be still." And the whole nature, everything stops. And there's complete calm. Now that's not your average miracle. That's a really, really impressive miracle. Surely the disciples would gather something from that, wouldn't they? He says, "Peace, be still." The wind ceased. There was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Do the disciples truly know who Jesus is? Well, clearly they do not. Well, Jesus is going to go across. He's going to go across the lake. And every time you see Sea of Galilee, I just want you to know that it's a little glamorous for what the Sea of Galilee is. It's actually a big lake. And the River Jordan that comes out of the Sea of Galilee, I would call a creek. I'm from western Pennsylvania, and I know what a river is. And we call these little streamlets sort of creeks. That's what I would call the Jordan River. But anyhow, they call it the Sea of Galilee. Okay? So they're going to the other side. They were on the western side, so this means they're going to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, to the country of the Gerasenes. That's not a part of Israel proper. And I'll tell you why that's an important element of the story in just a minute. When he stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. When he saw Jesus, he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Remember, the demons know who Jesus is. And what does Jesus do? This is part of the messianic secret motif in Mark. He silences these demons. Well, this is not, we've already had one exorcism. We had that back in chapter 1. But this is not your standard kind of run-of-the-mill exorcism. Here we have text here. And Jesus said to him, let's do this again. And Jesus said,
Technology is wonderful, isn't it?
And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Now, if you know anything about Judaism, you know that pork products are forbidden. That is not something you are allowed to eat. That's an unclean animal. So my question is, what are 2,000 pigs doing on the countryside here? But this is, in fact, outside of the bounds of Israel in this day and age. I also want to make it clear, if you ever go to Israel, and next year in Jerusalem, maybe we'll go. If you ever go to Israel, you will never eat bacon.
That's a shame.
It's really a problem. I mean, if you like bacon, that's not the place to go, because neither Jews nor Muslims eat bacon. And there was a real stink in Israel when the first McDonald's showed up. Because how do you have a cheeseburger? You're not allowed to mix meat and milk products. How can you put cheese on a burger? Well, they have that for the goyim, or the non-Jew, if you want to go and get one in Israel. But Jews do not eat cheeseburgers. Anyhow, they don't eat pork, but they're pork. I mean, there's swine here, obviously. And there's incredible property damage that's done. Jesus just destroys 2,000 pigs. And so the people of Gerasene sort of asked Jesus to leave after this story. But the important point is, this is not your run-of-the-mill exorcism. This exorcism involves the casting out of 2,000 demons from this individual. Not your normal miracle, super miracle. That brings us to the next story. After Jesus lands, he's going to go to the eastern side. Now he's going to come back to the western side, when he crossed again in a boat to the other side. A great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. Now again, notice how popular Jesus is. As soon as he lands, a great crowd is gathered around him. So I always sort of envision this Jesus sort of walking sort of like this, with the crowd pressing in on him and the like. And as he's going to Jairus' house, something else happens. So this is really an interrupted miracle. This is going to be picked up after another story that we read. And this is about a woman who is suffering. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering with hemorrhages for 12 years. Notice the detail here. They give you 12, been suffering for 12 years. And not only that, she'd endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. So not only is she not better, she's now a pauper. She has nothing. She's given it all to physicians, and her condition gets worse and worse and worse. So she heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now this is a really super miracle too, because now Jesus' clothing is starting to heal people. Jesus is walking along in this crowd, being pushed along to Jairus' house, when this woman blindsides Jesus. She in fact dives through the crowd so that she can touch the hem of his garment. He's looking that way, she's coming in from back and is going to touch the hem of his garment, and when she does, immediately she's healed. Immediately she felt in her that she was healed of her disease. Tremendous miracle, but it doesn't end there. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?' Jesus, wake up. You're in a crowd, and you stop and say, 'Excuse me, someone touched me.'" Well, all kinds of people have touched you. What do you mean? Who touched you? Do the disciples truly know who Jesus is? Who touched me? He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Incredible miracle. This is a super miracle as well. Well, because Jesus has stopped to interact with this woman, that's given Jairus' daughter a chance to die. So while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." You know, some people wear these bracelets. Actually, I don't really know if they're still around, but they used to have these bracelets, WWJD. What would Jesus do? You know, people try to imitate the actions of Jesus in their everyday lives. Well, here is one thing you do not want to imitate. Do not ever show up at someone's house where there's been a death and say, "Hey, what's the problem? Why are you weeping? What's the deal here? The person's only sleeping." Well, Jesus can get away with it, but I wouldn't suggest anyone try it. Because notice the reaction even Jesus gets when he says it. They laughed at him. Do these people know who Jesus truly is? Do the disciples even know? And he Then he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and where the child was, he took her by the hand and said, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Again, the messianic secret motif, don't tell anyone. Well, everyone else in the house knew that the little girl was dead, and when the little girl comes out alive, I would think someone would tell someone, but they're commanded not to tell anyone. They're commanded not to tell. Well, just in reviewing here, notice these 4 super miracles: the stilling of the storm, the Gerasene demoniac, the woman with the hemorrhage, and the raising of Jairus' daughter. Those are all incredible miracles. And then Jesus is going to go home again. He goes home, and notice what happens. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joses, and Judas, and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he was amazed at their unbelief. They took offense at him. Did Jesus' miracles? Now he's performed 9 remarkable miracles. Do people know who Jesus truly is? No, they do not. In fact, they are offended by him. Do Jesus' miracles, do they convince people of who Jesus truly is? No, they confound. They cloud Jesus' identity. They don't clarify, they cloud. And the language here, he was amazed at their unbelief, is the language that's used so often when people are amazed at what Jesus does. Now Jesus is amazed at their lack of faith after demonstrating his power on 9 separate occasions. Mark's gospel is going to continue with the death of John the Baptist. John is arrested according to the Gospel of Mark, and the mention of his arrest is way, way back in chapter 1. Just before Jesus begins his public ministry, John is arrested. The death of John is talked about in chapter 6. And it's in chapter 6 before we get the story of the loaves and the fishes, the feeding of the 5,000. John plays the role of a forerunner of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. We saw that in those initial verses. And the very fact that John the Baptist is going to be killed by the Romans, he's going to be beheaded by the Romans, is a foreshadowing of what is in store for Jesus. Not made explicit, but actually quite clear if you read through the text. But after the death of John the Baptist is narrated, then we're going to get back to the story of Jesus. And we're going to see Jesus do a number of things. He's first of all going to feed the 5,000. Feeding the 5,000, that's one of the very few miracles found in all 4 Gospels. The feeding of the 5,000. Then Jesus is going to do a lake crossing. Then he is going to have a controversy with the Pharisees. See that at the beginning of chapter 7, followed by the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, followed by a healing of deaf mute. So 4 more miracles are going to take place in this section, chapter 6:30 through 17, to the end of chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel. Okay, the feeding of the 5,000, you're all familiar with that story where Jesus doesn't have much to eat. They're in a deserted area, and so they collect what they have, and Jesus multiplies the loaves, and they feed 5,000 males. It's often thought, when you read the story, that it's talking about 5,000 total people. Actually, it's 5,000 males. So even more than 5,000 people that end up being fed in this miracle. So that's an incredible miracle. And then Jesus is going to send his disciples across the lake again. Jesus does a lot of back and forth here in the Gospel of Mark, between the east and the west bank of the Sea of Galilee. So he's going to send his disciples ahead while he remains behind to pray. But when he's finished praying, the disciples are now in the middle of the lake, the middle of the sea. And Jesus has to get to the boat. So Jesus goes the easy way. Jesus walks on water. Another one of his nature miracles. And here's the story of Jesus walking on the water. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, and he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind. He came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they cried out, but immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." If I put myself in that boat, and it's the middle of the night, and I'm out straining at the oars, and someone comes walking toward me and identifies themselves, that doesn't really calm my fears. What are you doing, Jesus, walking on the water? What is this? He came toward them early in the morning walking on the sea. When they saw him walking on the sea, they cried out. He speaks, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They've seen now this most remarkable miracle, Jesus multiplying the loaves, and they still don't understand. They see Jesus walking on the water, and they still don't understand. Their hearts are hardened. Well, Jesus performs a miracle. a miracle feeding. Then he's going to cross the lake the easy way. Then he's going to have a controversy with the Pharisees over eating. And then he's going to heal the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. The Syrophoenician woman's daughter is, in fact, a demoniac. She's possessed by a demon. And Jesus has a discussion with her about bread. She comes up, she is a Gentile. Syrophoenicia is up on the coast, which is outside of Israel, first century Israel. Jesus has gone there. And the Syrophoenician woman comes to him and says, "My daughter needs your help." And Jesus makes what appears to be a very, very cruel statement. He says it's not fair to take the children's bread and give it to dogs, which is a real slam against Gentiles. This bread is for Jews only. I can't give this to Gentiles. And the woman one-ups Jesus. She says, even the dogs eat the crumbs of the children's food. I'm not asking to take anything from the Jews. All I want are leftovers. Just give me what's left. And for that, Jesus says, go home, your daughter has been healed. Remarkable story. Remarkable story. That's followed by the healing of the deaf mute. A man that is not only deaf, but also can't speak. And Jesus is going to heal him as well. So we have 3 miracles in that section. Well, actually we have the nature, walking on the water, which is a nature miracle as well. But then when we get to the beginning of chapter 8, I want you to see that we have the feeding of the 4,000. And if you've been paying attention, you think, did I fall asleep and we're doing this again? Almost exactly the same story, the feeding of the 4,000. Well, if you look carefully at the passages that follow, you see that same editorial pattern. You see the feeding followed by a lake crossing. And this time Jesus isn't going to do anything miraculous. They just all go across the lake. Followed by a controversy with the Pharisees. Followed by a discussion about bread. Followed by the healing of the blind man. I want to look at this, the controversy of the Pharisees and the discussion about bread. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. They had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. This is just an amazing story. They've watched Jesus feed 9,000 plus people in the last couple of chapters with almost nothing. And they're concerned that they're not going to get lunch because they only have 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. How stupid can you be? How faithless can you be? Disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. They had only 1 loaf with them in the boat, and he cautioned them, watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, it's because we have no bread. They can't get lunch off their mind. Jesus says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And he said to them, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand? Because clearly they don't yet understand. The miracles of Jesus clarify for the people in the narrative the true identity of Jesus. They do not. They do not. In fact, they confound. And the disciples are every bit as clueless here as others in the story, even though they've been given the inside track, even though they have been told what all of these parables mean, and even though they have seen miracles that others have not witnessed. like the raising of Jairus' daughter. They still do not understand. They do not yet understand. Well, that's followed up by the healing of the blind man. And I told you last week that Mark's gospel being the first gospel, most of Mark is duplicated in either or, in both, some cases, both other gospels, Matthew and Luke's gospel. About 85% of Mark appears in Matthew, and about 50% of Mark appears in the Gospel of Luke. There are only a few verses from Mark that do not appear in either of those Gospels, and this is one of the miracle stories that does not. I'm going to read this, and I want you to tell me why, if Mark is first, Matthew and Luke knew this story and chose not to include it in their narrative. See if you can guess why. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." This is parallel to the healing of the deaf mute back in chapter 7. And there are characteristics that you can see parallels in both narratives. In both cases, Jesus spits. My students always point that out when I ask the question, what are the similarities between these two stories? Jesus uses saliva. Jesus takes the man outside of the city, leads him out of the village. And this miracle takes place outside of the village. But the other fact that unites these two, that makes these two very similar, is that both are double healings. In the first case, it's a deaf mute. Jesus has to heal two infirmities. In this case, it's a double healing because Jesus needs to do it twice. So, can you see anything, Jesus says, after the first try? The man looks up and says, "Well, I can see people, but they sort of look like trees walking around." So Jesus could have said, "Well, would you settle for 2200 vision?" That's better than nothing, I guess. You know? And the man says, "This isn't quite working for me." And so Jesus has to go back to the drawing board, and he does it a second time. And then he sees clearly. Now, why would Matthew and Luke choose not to include that in their narrative?
Partial failure?
Jesus isn't so good in that one, is he? Jesus sort of fails in the first attempt. It takes him 2 tries. Matthew and Luke must not have liked that. That didn't fit in with the portrait of Jesus that Matthew and Luke were drawing. But my question is, why does Mark include it? Mark certainly hasn't shown Jesus to be ineffective in any context. And everything that Jesus does happens immediately. He's demonstrated incredible power repeatedly in this gospel. Why would Mark choose to include this in the narrative? One of the principles of biblical scholarship, and you can take this to the bank with you, when you do not understand a biblical passage, don't stop reading. Keep reading because the context is essential. Keep reading the story. What's the meaning of this story? Well, let's push forward and see if we can understand. We're going to come back to this passage. I'm going to set this aside for a moment and then see what happens next. We are now at 8:26, and the gospel, the first part of the Gospel of Mark, is going to end at 8:30. So we have a few more verses before we get to the end. And those few verses function as a summary of the first 8 chapters. You all are familiar with the story that is told in this next section. This is Peter's confession. So Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And Caesarea Philippi is way, way, way up north. It's far north of the Sea of Galilee. It's up in a region that is in the very northern part of Israel. He went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, in light of all that you've seen in these first 8 chapters, who do people say that I am? And they answered him, well, John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But Jesus then asked him, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Messiah, which is the Hebrew word for Christ. Christ comes from the Greek word kreo, which means to anoint. Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means to anoint also. So Messiah and Christ are equivalent terms. One is Hebrew, one is Greek. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about it. Is that a correct confession? You are the Christ. How do we know that's correct? Because he tells them not to tell them. Just like the demons, shut up. He tells the disciples, he sternly orders them not to tell anyone about it. Well, this is a major, major breakthrough in the gospel. If you had a concordance, and concordance is a very helpful thing when you do biblical studies, you can look up where words are used. And you could look up very quickly that the term Messiah, or the term Christ, as it is, the text actually has Christ, but your translation puts in Messiah. Christ does not appear anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark prior to this, except in one word. The beginning of the good news of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. This is the first time it's used in the narrative, so clearly this is an important term. And finally, it would appear that the disciples have caught on. You are the Christ. You are the Christ. He sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about it. That's the end of the first 8 chapters. That's the conclusion of that first part of the Gospel of Mark. And now we're going to enter into the second part of the Gospel of Mark, the suffering Christ. And that's going to begin in 8:31. So just after we have this confession of Peter, Jesus is going to say, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite clearly. So now can you see the pivot? We've talked about what do people say I am, who do people say that I am based on what I've done up to this point. Now we're going to turn to the end of the gospel, to the death of Jesus in what's called a passion prediction. I have to be very careful when I talk to my students about the passion of Jesus, because they have a different understanding of passion than biblical scholars have. For biblical scholars, passion refers to the events leading up to and including the death of Jesus. And so this is a prediction of Jesus' death and the events that are going to surround the death. He's going to undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Okay, after Jesus gives this passion prediction, good old Pete, here's the beginning, 8:31. It's the beginning of this new section that's going to lead up and include the death of Jesus. After the passion prediction, Peter's going to take him aside and rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Why does Peter rebuke Jesus? Why does Peter rebuke Jesus? Well, I've heard many people say, well, Peter doesn't want to see Jesus talk about morbid subjects. He loves Jesus, he doesn't want Jesus to go, and things like that. All of that is wrong. That's not the reason for the rebuke. But to give you some background on this, I've got to do a little bit of history. So give me a moment, I'm going to give you some background on the reason that Peter is going to rebuke Jesus. This goes back to 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 7. Very, very important passage in the Hebrew Bible. David has, in fact, defeated all of his enemies. He's now the king of Israel. He's defeated all of his enemies, and he's moved the capital of the nation to Jerusalem. And because the capital is now Jerusalem, he's going to build a palace in Jerusalem. A beautiful, beautiful palace where he's going to reside. But as he's residing in his palace, he realizes that God doesn't really have a permanent residence. God has been sort of, his presence has been with this wooden box that's overlaid with gold. It's on poles that was picked up and carried around and then put under what's called the tent of meeting. So the Ark of the Covenant's put under this tent of meeting, but a very temporary thing that you pick up and take with you when the Israelites moved around. Well, they're now settled in the land. And David has extended the kingdom and all of that. It's about time we made a more permanent home for God. So in this chapter, chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, the short Hebrew term Beth, which means house, is going to be used in 3 different ways. It's going to refer to David's house, his palace. It's going to refer to the house of God, the temple. And then it's going to refer to David's house, that is a dynasty. 3 uses of the same little Hebrew term. So, David decides he's going to build a magnificent temple for the Lord, and he gets his prophet, Nathan, to go to God and get his approval on the building plans. And so Nathan sets off and tries to get God's approval. Well, here's what happens. When the King David was settled in his house, that is his palace, and the Lord God had given him rest from his enemies all around, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See, now I'm living in a house, of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." Well, Nathan doesn't get back the response he was expecting. And so he's got to communicate this, that God basically tells David, thanks, but no thanks. Moreover, the Lord declares to you, Lord, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house, a dynasty. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I'll raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house, in that case a temple, for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So God says, thank you, David, but no thanks. But because you've been so thoughtful about building me a house, I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. And that dynasty, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and your offspring, who is going to be King Solomon, is the one who will build that temple. Well, God is going to repeat what he said, the house, your dynasty, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before you, before me. Your throne shall be established forever. That's called the Davidic promise, the Davidic covenant. God makes this covenant with David. Your throne shall be established forever. And that promise was made in about the year 1000 BCE. Move ahead to 587 BCE, a man by the name of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has other plans for the Davidic dynasty and Jerusalem. King Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE is going to sack Jerusalem. And when he sacks Jerusalem, he is going to destroy the temple that King Solomon built. He is also going to then capture Judahites and deport them to Babylon. And he's going to capture King Zedekiah, who is the last or the reigning Davidic king. He's going to capture, blind, and deport King Zedekiah after he has executed all of King Zedekiah's family. So the last thing that King Zedekiah is going to see is the mass slaughter of his family. And with that comes the end of the Davidic dynasty. After the Judahites that had been taken into captivity are allowed to come back to Judah, and that's when they first become known as Jews. When they come back to Judah, these Judahites are going to rebuild the temple and all of that. But one of the things they do is go back and look at this promise that God made to establish a dynasty forever. And they think to themselves, well, God could not possibly have lied to us, but 400 years isn't exactly, it's a long time, but it's not exactly forever, is it? So they look at that passage and they say to themselves, well, God must not have meant that a continuous dynasty would exist, but that in fact a Davidic king would come who would rule forever. How can a Davidic king rule forever? Well, one of the things that is brought back from the captivity in Babylon is something that is called apocalyptic eschatology. This is a fancy term. Apocalyptic is a type of eschatology, and eschatology refers to the doctrine of the end of the world. It comes from the Greek term eschatoi, last things, from which we get ology and the doctrine of last things, and this is a type of doctrine known as apocalyptic. This was a very common way of thinking among Pharisaic Jews in the first century world. This is a dualistic perspective because it believes in this evil age where Satan is active, where we see in this age we have evil and injustice, suffering, and death. But according to the Bible, God will bring to a decisive end this evil age on the day of the Lord, which is a day of judgment. And on the day of the Lord, when this evil age is brought to an end, all of those who have lived in this evil age will stand before the judgment seat of God. Not when they die, but when the day of the Lord comes about. Well, people are going to be dead at that time. How do you judge dead people? Well, you've got to bring them back to life. So the resurrection of the dead is a part of this Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. And those who are found worthy through this judgment will be allowed to live into the age to come where God reigns supreme, where there is no evil, no injustice, no suffering, and no death. Well, how is it possible for the Messiah? How is it possible for a king to live forever? Well, if that king were to come at the end of this evil age, that king would help to usher in the age to come where there is no death. So this apocalyptic eschatology gets merged with the belief in the coming Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. It is a kingly title. Kings were anointed on the day that they ascended to the throne. And you have here the belief that the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, the new age will begin. Here's a critique of Christianity by a very prominent 20th century Jewish philosopher, Martin Buber. We've just done Peter's confession, so this is very appropriate for this time. Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi that Jesus was the Christ was a sincere confession, but not a true one. and it has not become any less untrue for having been repeated down the centuries. Why? The Messiah cannot have come in a particular moment of history because his appearing can only mean the end of history. The world was not redeemed 19 centuries ago because we still live in an unredeemed world. Yeah, we still have evil and injustice. We still have suffering and we still have death. The new age has not yet arrived, and yet Christians claim that Jesus is the Messiah. How do you make sense out of that when Buber is absolutely right? The Messiah is supposed to come at the end of the age. Well, this is one of the reasons why Paul points out here, Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom. We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews. Why is it a stumbling block to Jews? Why is Christ crucified a stumbling block to Jews? Because the Messiah is not supposed to die. There were a number of people in the first century world that claimed to be the Messiah. You know how they determined whether they were the Messiahs or not? They killed them. And if they died, well, shucks, we had high hopes in this guy, but he's dead. Can't be the Messiah. What has Jesus just said after Peter has said, "You are the Messiah"? What does Jesus say is going to happen? I'm going to die. And that's why Peter rebukes Jesus. Didn't you hear what I just said, Jesus? Messiah. Everyone knows the Messiah is supposed to live forever. No, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews. So, and this took me forever, so I hope this works. I don't know this. Anyhow, let me go back and show you Christian apocalyptic eschatology. As this evil age, Satan is active, it's characterized by evil, injustice, and death. But Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So his coming, his death, and his resurrection are understood, as I love one scholar's comment, that it is the D-Day event. But not all of the new age has begun. The new age will not be here in its fullness until the day of the Lord, which is in the New Testament called the parousia. And the parousia is the day when Christ returns, when the dead are raised and judged, and then the age to come takes place. So that's when we see that God reigns supreme and that this new age is characterized by the absence of evil, injustice, suffering, and death. That is the V-Day. So Christians live between the D-Day experience of the death and resurrection and the V-Day experience of the end. I like that for people that understand something about World War II. That speaks to you. My students often scratch their heads and aren't quite sure about the difference between D-Day and V-Day, but clearly you all understand that distinction. This is when you know who's going to win. We know who's going to win the ultimate victory. Even though it doesn't look like it at the present time, we know we are playing on the winning team. But that winning happens only at the parousia, that ultimate victory. So this is not the ultimate victory. This secures the future victory. But this is not God's ultimate victory. After Peter rebukes Jesus and shows that he does not truly understand, his lack of understanding now is becoming misunderstanding. Now he's thinking of Jesus in terms of the traditional understanding of the Messiah, which is someone who cannot die. After he shows his misunderstanding, Jesus is going to teach on discipleship. He called the crowd of his disciples and said to them, "If you want to become my followers, let them deny himself, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake, those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, then the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." So we have here another editorial pattern. We have a passion prediction followed by the disciples' misunderstanding, followed by a teaching on discipleship. And if you didn't get that in chapter 8, we're going to do it again in chapter 9. Here's the prediction in chapter 9. He went from there, passed through Galilee. He didn't want anyone to know it. He was teaching his disciples, saying, then the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they'll kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he'll rise again. But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. And then they're going to show that they don't really understand what Jesus says. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? They were silent, for on the way they'd argued with one another who was the greatest. Jesus is saying, I'm going to go lay down my life. And what are they talking about? Who among them is the greatest? Do the disciples really know? No, again, they show their misunderstanding. Jesus is going to teach a second time on discipleship. Jesus sat them down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. He took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes me, such a child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. And then if you didn't get it the second time, we're going to do it a third time in chapter 10. And this is the most specific passage. See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. They'll hand him over to Gentiles, and mock him, and spit upon him, and flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again. How can he be any more specific? The disciples understand who Jesus truly is? No? We're going to have another example of their misunderstanding. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, said to Jesus, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Whatever we ask of you, grant us to sit one at your right hand, one at your left in your glory. Jesus responds, you don't know what you're asking. To sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. The disciples want to be the right hand and left hand man of Jesus. They think he's going to come into Jerusalem, become the new king, and they want to be his first and second lieutenants. Do they really understand where Jesus is going after he's been so explicit? Of course they do not. And then he's going to teach on discipleship one last time. The Son of Man. Sorry. They heard this, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry